So thanks, everyone. Thanks especially to Marco and Fabrizio for organizing and to the discussants. I know this is a difficult time in Europe. It's early in the morning, as it is late in the evening here. As you might hear, some people passing under the window. And what I'll be talking about today is indeed binocular rivalry. I'll be focusing on one very prominent predictive coding explanation of binocular rivalry. My goal is to sort of persuade you that this prominent solution to binocular rivalry is actually wrong, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what we can do to fix it and where we should go from there, what that might mean. So just to kind of get off the ground, binocular rivalry occurs when the left eye and the right eye are presented with two competing stimuli at the same time. So for example, if the left eye is presented with a picture of a face and the right eye is presented with a picture of a house, the resulting subjective experience is of seeing first a face and then a house and then a face and then a house. And that's kind of a remarkable and unusual kind of perceptual experience. And so it's intrinsically interesting, right? It's unusual if, for example, if you show it to your undergrads, they're kind of, mesmerized by it and they want to know why that occurs. But I think it's of particular interest to psychologists and especially philosophers because it's something of a test case for perception. So if you have a general theory of perception, it can't just be in the business of explaining sort of the everyday kinds of perceptions, things like how we experience colors and shapes. A general theory of perception is also going to want to account for some of the harder cases, some of the trickier and more unusual kinds of perceptions. So a good theory will account for things like hallucinations, illusory experiences or all kinds of illusions, and things like bistable percepts, of which binocular rivalry is one, and particularly a vivid one. And so I think philosophers are interested in binocular rivalry because it's this interesting test case for some of the things that they're already thinking about when it comes to perception. I think philosophers are particularly interested in perception for kind of two general reasons. The first reason, kind of coming from the philosophy of mind, has to do with this idea that perception is something like the ground floor of the mind, right? This is an expression that comes from the philosopher Wayne Wu. He doesn't actually necessarily subscribe to this view, but he suggests that many of us think of perception as being the ground floor, where everything non-perceptual comes above perception. So cognition, motor systems, emotions, and so on. Kind of sometimes what philosophers take to be the interesting things, in fact, depend on perception. So if you're interested in developing something like an architecture of the mind, it's really important to understand what this sort of base layer is doing, what perception is doing. And so there are all these kinds of fundamental questions about perception. Do we perceive things like events? Do we perceive causation directly? Can we perceive moral events and things like that? But there are also these related questions of how perception relates to these so-called higher levels. So this is kind of perhaps best illustrated by the discussion around what's known as cognitive penetration. So the question to which, the degree to which perception is encapsulated from or integrated with higher level cognition. So is perception kind of siloed off in its own thing? Or is there a lot of kind of feedback from these higher level processes? And this is very much kind of a live discussion. So that's kind of one general area in which philosophers are interested in perception, but it's closely related to the other, which I think is epistemology, right? So perception is really important from the perspective of epistemology because perception is taken to be the basis for many kinds of knowledge, particularly for our knowledge about the external world. And so in some cases, this can be trivial. So if you take these two examples from Susanna Siegel, in the first case, if I see a jar of mustard in the fridge, right, then I have pretty good rational grounds for also having the belief that there is a jar of mustard in the fridge. But things are not always so straightforward between perception and belief. So here's Siegel's second example. If, for example, Jill is anxious about Jack, or she's afraid that Jack is angry with her, and so she perceives that Jack is angry, she really sees Jack as being angry. It's not just that she thinks it, but that's what she experiences, then it's not clear that Jill is as justified in believing that Jack is angry with her as she would be in thinking that there was a jar of mustard in the fridge if she saw that. And so there is this important connection between perception and belief, but there seem to be kind of factors that complicate the picture, and it becomes really important for philosophers not just to understand the relation between perception and cognition, but also how these interactions have implications for some of our justificatory practices. And so broadly in both these areas and kind of what I've described, I think we can say that perception has a mind-to-world direction of fit, right? Perception has something to do with the production of knowledge. It might not directly produce knowledge, but it's certainly a process that is related to the production of knowledge. Better and worse perception is kind of measured based on this mind-to-world direction of fit. But there are obvious challenges, there are obvious things that we're going to want to sort out. And one of the ways that we can get around to kind of figuring out what the contours of our perception are is by looking at these misleading or distorted cases. We can look at things like hallucinations, things like binocular rivalry. And so I think philosophers are interested in binocular rivalry because it's an interesting phenomenon, but it's also because we come to this interesting puzzling case with all these descriptive and justificatory interests in mind. And so what we do is we look for a theory of perception that can account for our everyday perceptions, but can also account for binocular rivalry. And ideally what we're looking for is a principled account of these unusual cases. And I think from a philosophical perspective, something that has an extra kind of gloss, or what would be the cherry on top, is if this theory could account for these unusual cases in formal terms, right? If we could get a formal theory of perception that accounted for all these test cases, right? So I think that's why philosophers are very excited about predictive processing, right? Because they can satisfy some of these interests. And I think for the same reason, when Jakob Howie and colleagues presented their predictive coding explanation of binocular rivalry in 2008, it was a very elegant solution, and it gave us kind of a reliable picture of what's happening in perception, but could also give a very rational explanation of what's happening in binocular rivalry. And so it became kind of a paradigm case of explaining binocular rivalry, but also of predictive coding itself, right? This account suggested to us that predictive coding is ubiquitous in the brain, but it also kind of showed us the explanatory power of predictive coding, right? This paper now gets cited as kind of a touchstone in other kinds of applications of predictive coding. We think, okay, hey, we can use predictive coding to explain binocular rivalry, so we can probably use it to explain all these other phenomena that we're interested in, say anorexia nervosa, right? And so this becomes kind of a touchstone for many discussions of predictive coding as kind of a success case. Now, what I want to do today is suggest that it is a really interesting explanation, but it may not be as successful as we need it to be. I'm going to argue in this talk that the epistemological explanation can account for a core feature of binocular rivalry, which is the role of reward in binocular rivalry. And so what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time just laying out the view in a little bit more detail. Then I'm going to present the challenge for the view. And I'm going to suggest that not all is lost actually in that moment. There are modifications that we can make to the predictive coding view, namely in the form of variational Bayes, that can help us account for the challenge that I've raised. But I'm going to suggest that if we do that, there are going to be other implications of variational Bayes, particularly for perception, that a philosopher that's interested in taking this route should be aware of. So it is indeed a modified solution to the challenge, but it doesn't come without its cost. And so hopefully that's where kind of we can spend some time in the discussion, and hopefully where we can kind of engage at the end of the talk. Okay, so just to kind of make sure that everyone's on the same page, what is the epistemological or predictive coding explanation of binocular rivalry? So again, binocular rivalry occurs when you have alternation between percepts. And the construct, sort of the technical idea that you want to keep in mind here when we talk about binocular rivalry is perceptual dominance. So perceptual dominance occurs when the participant experiences one of the percepts either first or for a longer period of time than the rival percept. And so there are basically two ways of measuring dominance. We can look at dominance in onset. We can ask, which percept does the participant see first? Does she see the face, right? Or does she see the house? Or we can also measure dominance over duration. And we can ask, over the period of fluctuation, which percept does she see more of, or in other words, longer. And we're going to see both of these measures seen through kind of the studies. And so I thought we could introduce that at the beginning. So Howie and colleagues, I think, frame very nicely what a good theory of perception needs to explain about binocular rivalry. In their original paper, they break it into two categories, the selection problem and the alternation problem. I think it's actually useful to break the selection problem into further two categories. So I'm going to talk about the individual versus group selection and individual versus individual selection problem before moving to alternation. So what needs to be explained in the individual versus group selection problem is the question of why, when a participant is presented with two stimuli, right, a face and a house, why is it the case that she ends up seeing only one of those at a time? So why not see a combination, a house-face, rather than seeing simply the face or the house that we end up seeing? Right? So that's our first question. Our second question, which is the individual versus individual selection, is, okay, having set aside the question of the combination percept, why is it that I see a face or a house, right? Why does the participant see a face or a house, one or the other? And then finally, the third and kind of probably the most interesting part of binocular rivalry is, why does this alternation happen? So, okay, if perception has settled on, for example, seeing a face, why doesn't it just stay that way? Why does it alternate back and forth between the two, right? And a good theory is going to be able to give kind of an elegant and unified explanation of all three of these features. So Howie and colleagues turn to predictive coding, specifically hierarchical predictive coding, or sometimes also called empirical Bayes, to provide kind of a general theory of how perception works to explain binocular rivalry. And so on the predictive coding view, the idea is that perception is not passive. Rather, it's a kind of active process whereby the mind infers external environmental causes based on its sensory input. And it does this in this top-down and bottom-up way that's integrated. So the top-down part involves these predictions where the mind basically makes predictions about the kind of sensory input that it's expecting. This is why it's sometimes called a controlled hallucination. And then it's paired with these bottom-up signals that suggest when the prediction is a little bit off. And it kind of sends these bottom-up signals to kind of try and refine the predictions as the process goes forward. Now, the feature that I think is very appealing of predictive coding is that these top-down and bottom-up processes are thought to conform to optimal Bayesian norms for integrating prior knowledge with incoming information. So the idea is that these processes can be modeled using Bayes' theorem, or specifically Bayes' rule regarding sort of posterior knowledge, right? Kind of what knowledge should I then expect to come based on what I have experienced or known in the past, and in conjunction with what I am experiencing now. So we have this kind of unified picture of perception. It's also extended in the literature to accounting for action. So it's kind of a mirrored process rather than making predictions and then revising them in light of prediction errors, incoming prediction errors, or incoming sensory information and bottom-up prediction errors. The idea is sort of reversed. So an example that Colin Klein likes to use is that, for example, if I want to use prediction error minimization to act, if, for example, I want to drink a glass of water, I simply predict that I am, in fact, drinking a glass of water, right? And then I use my prediction errors, which suggest, no, you're not drinking a glass of water, to kind of leverage my way to the correct state of affairs, where in fact my prediction and my incoming signals match, such that I have changed the world so that my prediction is true and I am in fact drinking a glass of water. And so this is very nice. You can use the same framework to account for both perception and action, and sort of this gives us the idea that there might be a unifying and principled account of some of the core processes in the mind. Now, the last idea that I kind of want to introduce before turning to the explanation of binocular rivalry here is the notion of precision. So we have these top-down and bottom-up processes, but there's an additional measure. And we have this additional top-down measure which suggests how confident or how much emphasis we should place on the prediction errors. So the idea is basically that not all prediction errors are made equal, and we want to weight them. And we use precision as that measure whereby we can weight prediction errors. So how does all of this kind of get bundled in to explain binocular rivalry? And here's kind of where the magic happens, right? It is a very elegant solution. So the first part of the explanation has to do with individual group versus group selection, and the idea is basically something like this. Both a face and a house predict the incoming percepts, predict the incoming sensory information equally inaccurately, right? A face only accounts for half of what the participant is seeing, and a house also only accounts for half of what the participant is seeing. And so the probability here is actually quite low. So maybe we should expect to see a house face. Well, we don't, because in fact the prior for seeing a house face is lower still, right? So there aren't many house faces out there in the world. We think to ourselves unconsciously, right, that seeing a house face is a very low prior probability. And so despite the fact that a face or a house explains the incoming stimuli quite poorly, it's still better than a house face would be, and so we end up seeing a house or a face. Now this logic is extended to the idea of individual versus individual selection. Both explain the evidence equally poorly, but they do so equally. And so basically all else being held equal, we have roughly equivalent chances of seeing, in this case, a face or a house. Things get particularly cool when it comes to alternation on this view because the idea goes as follows. One percept has been selected. Let's say it's a face, right? We know that the face accounts quite poorly for the two images that are being presented. The result is that there is a corresponding bottom-up prediction error, which says, hey, the face is not being accounted for. So the hypothesis switches, and the idea is, okay, maybe what I'm seeing is instead a house, but again, the corresponding prediction error for face suggests, no, that's not correct, and basically, in some respects, the hypotheses here alternate to try and account for what the participant is being presented with, right? This is a nice explanation. I think even the most hardened critic of predictive coding reads this paper and thinks that's a very elegant account, right? It seems to have this principled explanation of what's going on there. It's a unified account. And indeed, right, it has had kind of its mark on the literature, and because it's this important test case for perception, Howie says something like, you know, if it can explain binocular rivalry, then it can explain perception in general, right? And so we get these statements, particularly in the book, of minimizing prediction error can explain perception in general. And as we saw, it's taken into account not just for perception, but also for action. So we get this picture, as he puts it, the emerging picture is that the organism needs to alternate between perceptual and active inference. So basically what organisms are doing on this view, and this is sometimes called a grand unifying theory or a gut theory, right, is what we are in the business of doing is alternating between perceptual and active inference. What we are in the business of doing is minimizing prediction error. Now, this wouldn't be a philosophy talk if it just had nice things to say about another theory, or, you know, just constructive, you know, positive things to say about a theory. And so what I want to suggest is that, elegance aside, there is a very important feature of our perceptual experience that this account cannot explain. And this feature is the role of reward in dominance, right? So reward results in perceptual dominance in binocular rivalry. We get this in a couple of cases, and I'll go into detail here, but in one set of experiments, we see that stimuli that are associated with reward result in increased dominance of the rewarded stimuli. We see the same thing with rewarded percepts. So a percept that's associated with a reward results in increased dominance of that percept. And finally, we see the similar effect, or we see an analogous effect between percepts that are associated with cost. So if there's a percept associated with a given cost, we see increased dominance of the non-punished percept. So not the punished percept, or not the costly percept, but the one that's associated with, that's not associated with the punishment, so the non-punished percept. And so I think what I want to do in this part of the talk is kind of go into these experiments in detail, because I think what we want to do is really ask ourselves, can the hierarchical predictive account for these for these findings, right, and I'll make some suggestions about some possible ways that a predictive coder could kind of address these findings. I'll still find that that they're not satisfactory, but what we want to do is look at the experiments in detail so everyone can kind of dig in and think about, okay, are there ways of accounting for this data or not? So in the first couple of experiments, Emily Balcetis and colleagues studied the effect of rewarding a stimulus. Right, and so the general finding here is that yes, a rewarded stimulus results in increased perceptual dominance, but what I want to show you is kind of how the experiment works. So what they asked participants to do is to learn that numbers or letters are associated with rewards or costs. So just for ease of use here, we'll say that letters are associated with rewards and numbers are associated with costs. Of course, they varied this randomly in the actual experiments, but what they did is they trained participants to make these sort of value associations, and then they trained them how to report what they saw in binocular rivalry, and they presented them with the percepts that they had been trained up on. Now, you'll notice here that the experimental paradigm is just a little bit different, but it works in roughly the same way. Rather than putting a partition between the left and the right eye, what they did was they had participants wear glasses with colored lenses, one which is red, one which is cyan, and this has the effect kind of like if you've ever been to a 3D movie, which only allows you to see one percept. And so the percepts are actually overlain in front of the participant, but the effect is the same of binocular rivalry. Now, again, I just kind of want to, because I really want to throw everything we can from the predictive coding perspective at this experiment and see if we can figure out a way that they could explain it, just want to talk a little bit about the kinds of controls that they had in place. So the way that they measured dominance here was at onset, so just looking at what the first percept was. And they tried to control for factors like salience, exposure, response selection, and task availability. So to try and control for salience, they made all of the stimuli the same. To try and account for exposure, in previous studies they had conducted, they had used things like sea creatures versus domestic animals. And so the idea was, well, maybe domestic animals are more familiar to most participants. And so here they had simply decided to use numbers and letters, which should be equally familiar to everyone. And in particular, because this is a learning task with explicitly learning to associate reward with certain stimuli, they introduced this dot task to make sure that participants were instantly reporting that they saw the rewarded stimuli in order to get the reward that the monetary reward that they were promised. And so the dot task worked as follows. You see in the box on the screen that the percepts are overlain, but there's a black dot, and the black dot is only touching one of the two figures, right? So in this case, it's touching the gray number 5, but it's not touching the blue G. And so what would happen is they would ask participants, in addition to asking them what percept they were seeing, or they would ask them whether the dot was touching or not touching the percept. And this was designed to control for whether they were just lying about the stimulus and saying, oh yes, I'm seeing the rewarded stimulus, I'm seeing the rewarded stimulus, and thereby kind of accruing their little financial pot. And so the participants didn't know how the dots were distributed or what that had to do with the reward, and so they tried to control for response selection that way. They also try to control for task availability. So one of the interpretations that one might have that has nothing to do with predictive coding is just this idea that by reading the instructions, for example, participants might be more primed to perceive letters. Or conversely, since they were trying to accrue rewards, they might be more primed to perceive numbers. And so what they did was they shifted the social context of the reward structure. So they rewarded the participant in the first block, but in the second half of the trials, the money that they accrued would go to a disliked other. The idea here being that if what is being picked out in perceptual dominance is actually availability, right, then the results would stay constant across both reward structures. Conversely, if it was reward that was driving perceptual dominance, then there would be dominance in the first half where the participants were rewarded, but not in the second half where they were rewarding the disliked other. And that's in fact what they found, right? So here what we see in the study is that when letters were rewarded, they were perceptually dominant. When numbers were rewarded, they were perceptually dominant. But we see that this effect only holds when the participant herself or himself is rewarded, and this effect goes away immediately when the money goes to a disliked other, right? So we have our first piece of evidence that reward plays a role in perceptual dominance in binocular rivalry. Now, despite the dot task, the question might be, what role does learning play when participants are learning to associate the stimuli with the reward? And so this was kind of the question that motivated the next series of experiments by Wilberts and colleague in 2014, which decided to kind of bypass the rewarded stimulus and just look at what would happen if participants became rewarded based on the percepts that they rewarded. Based on the percepts that they reported. And so again, you see here that the paradigm changes just a little bit, but I'm only explaining this for ease of reference later on. In this set of experiments, rather than showing numbers and letters, they just showed angled colored gratings. And so red gratings and blue gratings, again, using the same kind of goggles. And so the result would be seeing alternating red and blue tilted gratings in binocular rivalry. So again, just to kind of give you all the equipment that you might need to kind of see if we can account for this, this evidence, what they did was that since it was kind of a conditional learning task, they first trained participants to report what they saw in a binocular rivalry task, and then they gave them the following set of instructions. So they told the participants, okay, from now on, you will hear the sound of a falling coin during one of the colors, red or blue, and this means that 10 cents has been added to your account or subtracted to your account, depending on which experiment they were in. So your task is still to respond to every target you see, just as before. Right? And so because they can't measure perceptual dominance at onset here, of course, they measured dominance in terms of duration. And the question would be, okay, what roles do reward and punishments have, respectively, on the percepts? Now, as I flagged for you in advance, right, we get something a little bit unexpected. Percepts that are associated with reward behave in the same way as the stimuli had in the Bell set of studies, but here what we get is increased dominance of the non-punished percept. So again, a little bit unexpected, this is going to prove to be what I think is challenging for the predictive coder trying to account for some of this data. So you look at this data, and if you're a predictive coder or you're a friend of a predictive coder, you get a little bit worried, or you think, okay, I don't exactly know how to account for this. If you are a friend of reinforcement learning or someone like me, you might, there's no emoji for Schadenfreude, but that's the kind of experience you have. You think to yourself, okay, I'm not sure how someone like Howie would be able to account for this, but you think to yourself, okay, there have to be alternatives. And so what I did in my case was I just emailed Friston and his student, Philip Schwartenbeck, and I asked them, okay, what do you say to these results? And I was a little bit encouraged in my Schadenfreude way that the response that I got was, that's very interesting, right? They didn't right away have an explanation of what could be going on. So I had thought, okay, maybe they'll just respond and there's this obvious solution to how this could be accounted for, but that wasn't the case. They thought that these were interesting results. They weren't familiar with them, and so we sort of emailed back and forth, maybe my proposing some solutions that they could, that the predictive coder could appeal to, and we kind of hashed them out. So here are some of the possibilities that at least at first pass come up for the predictive coder to try and account for these results. So the first suggestion that I made is, look, maybe a reward just has a higher prior, right? We know that the prior plays a role in what's perceived, so maybe a reward has a higher prior. Right away, that gets ruled out when you look at the details of the experiment, because that's something that's very much controlled for. So it's not highest prior, but okay, we at least considered it. What I took to initially be slightly more plausible was the idea that reward just amounted to another piece of information, right? So that there was more to explain, more to account for in a percept that included reward. And so that simply played the role of having a higher likelihood, right? It's just another thing that needs to be accounted for, and so when that explains the evidence better, dominance shift towards the better account with the higher likelihood. Unfortunately, I think this is the problem that comes in with the fact that the punishment results don't work the way that the reward results do, right? Remember, the non-punished percept basically stays the same. The punished percept basically stays the same. What happens is the non-punished percept becomes dominant. And so if reward were simply a piece of information, we would expect punishment to simply just be an additional piece of information too, to have the same effect. But that's not what we see. So we kind of think it's probably not higher likelihood. Now, Matteo, because he's my generous discussant, in the margins of the paper, suggested, well, maybe a predictive coder might appeal to the idea of higher precision. This wasn't something that actually came up between Kristen Schwartenbeck and I, but I thought it was definitely worth considering. The one reason I think it's probably not higher precision that's accounting for this perceptual dominance is the fact that if reward acts like attention, right, if it has this precision effect, we would expect to see that even in the case where the other recipient was receiving the reward, and we don't see that. Or if we did want to use precision in that account, I think we'd have to tell an additional story about why the precision measure shifts across the reward structure. So that's not to say anything about Matteo. I'm not sure that detail was included in the original draft of the paper, but I think that's a reason to at least worry about the precision explanation for perceptual dominance based on reward. What Friston ultimately suggested was that a modified version of the predictive coding account called variational Bayes could account perhaps for these rewards through a mechanism or kind of an effective variational Bayes known as optimism bias. And so what I want to spend a little bit of time doing now is kind of just contrasting the differences between predictive coding or empirical Bayes and variational Bayes, and then quickly looking at how variational Bayes may be able to account for the role of reward and perceptual dominance. So you'll recall that on empirical Bayes, we use the same Bayesian account to account for perception and action, but as Howie suggested in that last quote there from 2013 and elsewhere, what perception and action do there is they alternate. So an organism is either perceiving or acting, but the two systems basically alternate back and forth, and they certainly aren't integrated in any way. What happens in variational Bayes is that action basically becomes internalized. It itself becomes an internal inference problem. And so we have perception and action here, but we can think of action now in terms of policies, where policies are basically internal representations of actions. And on variational Bayes, the important thing here is that perception and perceptual inferences and policy inferences are integrated. So inferences about perceptual states are conditional on inferences about policy states or control states, and vice versa. So there's this sudden integration. And because policy also is now based on an inference, it too comes with its own measure of precision, right? And so it has the same name, it has similar features, and there are going to be some things in common that we see, but the thing that I want to emphasize here about variational Bayes is this integrated picture, because it is what is going to be responsible for creating this optimism bias effect that we will draw on in the explanation. So how does a perceptual inference take place in variational Bayes? It has three kind of terms here, two of which will be very familiar. So perception is updated using empirical prior beliefs, same as in empirical Bayes, as well as sensory evidence. But there's a third term now, right? It's conditional on the policies as well. And so perception is itself conditional on the expected value of each state, right? And this is going to result in a kind of top-down effect when certain features are true of precision. So when policy precision is high, perception is going to be biased towards the state that has the greatest potential to realize the agent's goal. So in other words, when precision is high, the idea is that some of the policies that I like the most are going to be the most likely. And so this is going to kind of give a top-down effect for the control states or the policies. And because they're integrated on variational Bayes, these control states are also going to have this top-down effect of which perceptual states I'm likely to encounter, right? I'm making a prediction about what perceptual states I might be in. Because they're conditional on the policies that I think are going to be likely, it will have a kind of top-down effect on my perceptual states. The result of this, and here the description can be a little bit loose, but just kind of bear with me, the result is something like the psychological effective optimism bias, right? Conditional on policies that I like, I'm also slightly more likely to see perceptual states that I like as well, right? And so this is starting to look a little bit like what we might see with reward and perceptual dominance. And in fact, that is the kind of explanation that Friston and Schwartenbeck might want to give in order to explain reward dominance. So supposing that we are in that third set of experiments with the red and blue gradings, right, if I'm trying to figure out what the probability of seeing the red rewarded percept is going to be, I take into consideration its prior likelihood, right? I take into consideration the sensory evidence that I have that I'm currently perceiving, but I also take into consideration the expected value of seeing the red dot. So what, it would be a good policy to perceive the red dot given that I'm rewarded when I see it. And if I'm confident that that is going to be the case, right, and given the experimental setup, it's reasonable to expect that, then precision will have this kind of top-down effect, and I'm slightly more likely to, in fact, perceive the red grading. Now, I think the advantage of variational Bayes is that it can account for reward dominance, but it can also especially account for punishment. So the interesting case here is that it doesn't really need to take the punished percept into account in any different way. This is because the value of seeing the red percept, say the rewarded percept, or what would have been the non-punished percept, remains the desirable or the valuable policy. If the blue percept is punished, then the best policy is to see the red percept. And it has the same top-down effect via precision and the policies in order to slightly increase the probability of perceiving a red percept. So I think this is a nice outcome. There are various things that we might want to say about this idea of precision. One of the qualifiers that Friston and Schwartenbeck mentioned is that precision has to itself be optimized. It has to be at the right level. And there are lots of questions about how that's done and how that would be implemented naturalistically, but they sort of highlight that if precision is too low, then there will be no value in any actions whatsoever, and that will result in basically no action selection. And this is something that they associate with something like Parkinson's disease. And conversely, if precision is too high, then this might lead to kind of very, very wishful seeing, right? And this is something that they kind of associate with the symptoms of schizophrenia. So that's just the kind of picture that they present, just to kind of highlight that they do sort of suggest that precision has to be within the right kinds of bounds to work in the way that they describe in optimism bias. So where does this leave us? I think, we can take variational Bayes to be a solution to reward dominance in binocular rivalry. I think what I want to do in the discussion here is not necessarily debate the merits or the mathematical kind of features of variational Bayes. What I want to suggest is that given what our philosophical interests are in predictive coding, we should be careful about the kinds of modifications that we take on board when we take on board something like variational Bayes. And so I just kind of want to throw up some comparisons here between empirical Bayes and variational Bayes. So recall that on the empirical Bayes picture, as I've already mentioned, perception and action kind of alternate. But on the variational Bayes picture, perception and policies, control states are in fact integrated. And so if we come as philosophers to predictive coding because we're interested in perception and because we have this interest in this sort of theoretical mind-to-world picture of perception, that's not the same exact picture that the variational Bayes account is going to substantiate for us. Right? Because perception is conditional on policies in variational Bayes, we get something more like maybe a world-to-mind picture of perception. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But what I want to suggest is that if we come to predictive coding, hoping that it will give us an account of perception that will allow us to secure and kind of quantify and understand where perception is reliable and where perception is not and why, then variational Bayes isn't going to do quite that same work for us. I think it's going to raise different kinds of questions regarding perception, justification, and cognitive penetration. So just to kind of return to this idea of theoretical perception, I said that perception on the traditional picture, and for many of us, has a mind to world direction of fit. What we're doing is we're in the business of learning about the world as best we can. And this is something that is true even if you are a proponent of cognitive penetration on the traditional view. Then cognitive penetration occurs when your prior knowledge or your prior beliefs penetrate your perceptions. Right? So cognitive penetration is still a case of perception that is roughly in the business of producing knowledge. The question is, how does our prior knowledge affect this incoming knowledge, and how should we weight it, and so forth. Now, of course, not everyone has this picture of perception. Prominent exceptions to this view are by Dustin Stokes and Susanna Siegel and colleagues. But I think roughly, as philosophers, we have this idea of perception as being theoretical, as having to do with knowledge, or as having to do with a mind to world direction of fit. But if you take variational Bayes seriously, and that's fine if one does, then the picture of perception that we get is a little bit different. It either has a world-to-mind direction of fit, depending on how influential you think those policies are, or something that Matteo and I have started discussing recently is this possibility that they might have a push-me, pull-you direction of fit. In other words, that they're descriptive and directive at the same time. And so I think this is a completely acceptable outcome. I think that is a bullet that I would, for example, be willing to bite. But I think for many philosophers, because I'm not a predictive coder, but I think for many philosophers who are appealing to predictive coding as a formal account of what is taking place in perception, they may be unknowingly kind of taking on board these additional consequences when they think of variational Bayes. And they may need to think of cognitive penetration not just as something involving prior beliefs and prior knowledge, but also kind of this role of policies, or this motivational component. And the same is true of someone who is a proponent of top-down processing, right? Top-down processing is a big part of even empirical Bayes, but again, the idea is that what's top-down are prior predictions, are prior expectations of what we expect to see. And that's not the only thing coming downstream in variational Bayes. And so if you think that perception is serving the goal, we have perception in the service of adaptive behavior, that's okay, but it will require that we sort of revise this picture of perception that we have. Or if you're someone like me, if you're someone like Susanna Siegel, right, then variational Bayes account may be just more grist for your mill. But the important thing is, I think, for philosophers who are coming from these other disciplines, to make sure that when they take variational Bayes on board, that they kind of know what they're getting themselves into. Just to kind of quickly wrap up, this is my last slide. I just kind of wanted to emphasize what kind of picture of the world we might be getting here, and this is something that we might want to talk about in the discussion as well. But Dustin Stokes in his paper kind of suggests that if we have cognitive penetration, for example, by desire, the structure is going to be very different than it is if it's going to be penetrated by prior knowledge or beliefs, right? And the idea here is that this is going to be a problem for justification. So he says at the end of this quote, then that perceptual experience that has had this penetration from a desire cannot justify a belief or provide knowledge. Now, I don't think that the picture that we're being presented with in variational Bayes is going to be that we have chronic desires influencing our perceptions, but nonetheless, we do seem to have chronic policies influencing our desires on the variational Bayes picture, and while maybe less full-bodied than a full-fledged kind of personal level desire, it is not intermittent, right? It's an ever-present feature of our perception. So I don't think it raises the same kind of challenge that Dustin Stokes is talking about here, but it gives us a different consideration that we want to discuss or kind of think about when we take on board the variational Bayes account. Okay, that's it. Thank you.